It shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that homosexuality between human beings is not a new behavior. It has been around for as long as our species has. Most people think of the gay scene in the United States as being fairly recent within the last century, but it actually developed during the 19th century during the gold rush in San Francisco, California. There was an overwhelming amount of men that were alone, isolated, and without the companionship that they desired. Due to these conditions, men would turn to each other for comfort and sometimes romantic same-sex relationships. By the late 19th and 20th century, informative and scientific works such as Psychopathia Sexualis by Krafft Ebing were being distributed publicly. Influential figures such as Alfred Kinsey paved the way for LGBTQ right discussions. And soon after, the view of homosexuality shifted from a moral judgment to a scientific study. Despite that, social and legal challenges bloomed for those who identified as being homosexual. In the 1930s, homosexual men were rounded up by the Nazis and were put into concentration camp under Germany's law, paragraph 175. While that law was repealed in the early 1990s, there was a long way to go for homosexual individuals to be accepted into society. Influential figures such as Alan Turing faced legal and social repercussions from their sexuality. Eventually, the shift towards acceptance started, but this did not happen for many decades, and even now in the 2020s, people who identify as being LGBTQ are struggling to find acceptance. This is part one of the LGBTQ rights movement. I'm your host, Lauren Powers, and you are listening to Not Your History Class podcast. Our standard education has barely touched upon the depth, violence, and tragedy of human history. My intention with this podcast is to illuminate the parts of our history that have been in the dark for far too long. I want to take a comprehensive dive into our world and to give a different and new perspective on our past. After all, education is our strongest weapon against tyranny. Please note, this podcast contains content and information that may not be suitable for children under the age of 13. Please be advised. It may seem like the gay scene in America is relatively new within the last 100 years or so, but it developed with men traveling to California to seek their fortune in the mid-century 1800s during the gold rush. 90% of the new immigrants to this part of the United States were men, and the way that the social structure of boom towns and mining camps were created led the way for same-sex relationships to develop. Susan Lee Johnson, who wrote Roaring Camp, The Social World of the California Gold Rush, said that, quote, "What we know is that they were probably quite common, but we don't have the documentation to say how common. It's not the sort of thing you would write home about. But fortunately, we have things like diaries and court records. We have at least one divorce case where a woman divorced her husband because he kept bringing men home and she was not happy about that." End quote. The shelters that held these miners were often cramped and would sometimes house multiple miners at once, so these men would find comfort in one another. At the time, gender roles were very pronounced, and due to a lack of women, men would have to slip into what was considered a more feminine role to survive and entertain themselves. Quote, "In the diggings, men would put on parties where they would dance together. Hopefully they had someone who had a fiddle, maybe a guitar, and they would dance together. And sometimes, at least according to some of the observers, some of the men would take on the female role in the dance." End quote. There's irrefutable proof of one gay couple, Jason Chamberlain and John Chaffee, that had came to California from New England in 1849. Quote, "They came to the area called the Southern Mines and mined together. And I am sure that they are not the only couple like this. They are clearly the best documented because they never left. You know, they built a house together in the town that became Groveland, and they stayed there for the rest of their lives." End quote, wrote Johnson. Unfortunately, Chaffee had to go to Oakland for medical care and he passed away. His partner received the information of his death via mail. Chamberlain, 2 months later, took his own life when he could not deal with the grief. In 1886, there was a book published called Psychopathia Sexualis by Dr. Richard von Krafft-Ebing, a forensic pathologist. In 1906, when it was translated to English, the book became a wild sensation. The book condemned any form of sex other than heterosexual sex. It was truly a unique book as it was the first literature of its kind to discuss sexual perversity. He intended for the book to create scientific advancement. The public was reading his book due to the work illustrating, quote, the large number of variant forms of sexual behavior, end quote. The book was described by historian Henry Oosterhuis as, quote, a kind of form that allowed homosexuals and others to breach the loneliness and alienation that characterized their lives within 19th century bourgeois society, end quote. Krafft-Ebing was a medical superintendent at a mental asylum in Germany from 1872 to 1880. It was more like a prison than a hospital, and he had access to patients that had a range of mental illnesses, including individuals who committed sexually motivated crimes. He used the case studies to create Psychopathia Sexualis. It started with 42 case studies, but by its 12th edition, it had expanded to 238. There is a sort of voyeuristic, cultish appeal that comes with reading this book, especially during the Victorian age, a particularly conservative time within recent history. Krafft-Ebing's Psychopathia Sexualis was groundbreaking due to its understanding of human sexuality, especially discussing how homosexuality was an innate characteristic rather than a choice. At the time, this was not the belief. Unfortunately, at the time, homosexuality was seen as a failing. It was considered degenerate and even a crime. While Krafft-Ebing did promote that homosexuality was wrong, he also suggested that homosexuality was not a vice or a sin, but rather a biological aspect. People believed that homosexuality was learned or chosen behavior. This had a significant impact as the conversation started to steer away from morality and towards science, which led to research into sexual orientation as a natural aspect of human behavior. This led others to challenge the legal and social consequences that homosexuals faced at the time. In fact, one famous individual and a personal favorite author of mine who was sent to prison for being gay was Oscar Wilde, of The Picture of Dorian Gray and the Importance of Being Earnest. He was living in Britain, and at the time, homosexuality was considered a criminal offense and a major societal taboo. He had gone back and forth between hiding his sexuality and trying to find some public acceptance. Wilde was intimately involved with the son of Sir John Sholto Douglas. Douglas was incredibly angry at Wilde's relationship with his son, and so he started to object to Wilde's behavior in public, and Wilde sued him for libel. In the court, the defense said that Wilde had gotten 12 young men to commit sodomy between 1892 and 1894. On the third day of the proceedings, the overabundant amount of evidence that the defense had caused Wilde's lawyer to withdraw the suit. The Crown issued a warrant for Wilde's arrest, and while Wilde could have fled to France, he decided instead to stay and stand trial. During the trial, chambermaids testified that they had seen young men in Wilde's bed, and Wilde was denied bail. He was cross-examined at the trial about his homosexual tendencies, and the first trial had a hung jury. The second trial, which had many potential witnesses that refused to testify. Nevertheless, Wilde was convicted, and the judge said at the sentencing, quote, "It is the worst case I have ever tried. I shall pass the severest sentence that the law allows. In my judgment, it is totally inadequate for such a case as this. The sentence of the court is that you be imprisoned and kept to hard labor for 2 years." End quote. Oscar Wilde served his 2 years, and then he spent the last 3 years of his life in exile. He passed away at the age of 45 and was buried in Paris. In 1919, Magnus Hirschfeld, a sex reformer and a sexologist, opened the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin, Tiergarten. It was the first of its kind in the world and the first to attempt a sexual science. This was happening during the Weimar period in Germany, which was the name given to the German government between 1918 to 1933. There was a lot of economic hardship during this time, including political unrest and violence. These challenges paved the way for Hitler to rise to power. On the opposite side of that, there was a vibrant and artistic movement happening at the same time. The Institute's biomedical explanation of human sexuality helped to form the framework of sexual science. Soon it was a sought-after address for scientists, politicians, and academics. For those who lived in Berlin, it was an institution that provided counseling and treatment for, quote, physical and psychological sexual disorders, end quote, as well as sexual transitions, which was Hirschfeld's umbrella term for homosexuals, transvestites, and intersex individuals. The Institute also housed the World League for Sexual Reform, as well as the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, the first homosexual organization. Immediately, the Institute was defamed and denounced as Jewish, social democratic, and offensive for public morals. In 1933, when Hirschfeld was out of town, fascist students led by Nazi stormtroopers invaded the institution and took books, where they burned them on Berlin's Opera Square. Hirschfeld had to watch on television while his life's work was burnt literally to the ground. It was an attempt to erase Hirschfeld from history, but they were unsuccessful. In the 1920s, Harlem became the largest black neighborhood, with individuals coming from Jim Crow South to northern states to find jobs. Harlem became the center for black culture as well as the rising LGBTQ social life, and this fostered, quote, a sense of new possibilities. Sexuality became a form of freedom. Expressing sexuality became a form of emancipation, end quote, says Octavio Gonzalez, an associate professor of English and creative writing at Wellesley College. He is also an expert on the Harlem Renaissance. In 1920, in the United States, prohibition was passed, which banned the manufacturing, transporting, and sale of liquors. This was not easy to enforce, and many people found workarounds, such as opening up speakeasies, which were illegal drinking spots, and increasing the illegal selling of liquor, called bootlegging. This ended up paving the way for LGBTQ nightlife and drag balls, which author Langston Hughes called spectacles in color. James Wilson, author of Bull Daggers, Pansies, and Chocolate Babies, Performance, Race, and Sexuality in the Harlem Renaissance, and a professor of English at LaGuardia Community College, said that, quote, the Harlem Balls, or the Fairy Balls, as they were oftentimes called, attracted people from all over the country to converge on the Renaissance casino. And they would cross-dress. There were contests. There were awards given for the most lavish gowns and costumes. They became celebrity events. These were in the gossip columns, end quote. The first documented U.S. gay rights organization was the Society for Human Rights, also known as SHR, was founded in 1924 by Henry Gerber, who was a German immigrant. There were several police raids made on the organization, and only a year later they were forced to disband. Before they separated, they made several publications of their newsletter called Friendship and Freedom. In 1871, paragraph 175 was a German statute that had criminalized homosexual relationships between men. It initially had been sporadically enforced, but in 1934, a special Gestapo division was set up to target homosexuals, and by June of 1935, the Nazis revised the criminal code. Anyone who was found guilty of homosexual tendencies could spend up to a decade in prison. While paragraph 175 targeted homosexual men, it didn't have such a strong persecution against gay women. It was not accepted at that time for women to be gay, but they were not persecuted. Rarely women were arrested or punished for being gay. Homosexual men did not have a place in the Nazi ideal. They did not help grow the Aryan nation, and in their eyes were unfit to be soldiers. In October of 1935, Heinrich Himmler had created the Reich Central Office for Combating Homosexuality and Abortion, which meant that the police could arrest and jail anyone that they deemed to be dangerous to Germany's moral fiber and could hold them indefinitely. About 90,000 gay men were arrested between 1937 to 1935. About 5,000 to 15,000 were imprisoned in concentration camps. The death rate is unknown, but Rudiger Lotman, a professor of sociology and a scholar, thinks that the death rate was about 60%. Survivors of concentration camps stated that the men who wore the homosexual symbol of the pink triangle were often severely treated by guards and other inmates due to rampant homophobia at the time. Many individuals were subjected to sexual and physical abuse. From 1942, SS camp officials and judges had the right to castrate imprisoned homosexuals without the men's consent. The year after that, homosexuals were part of the SS-sponsored program, which practiced extermination through work. Even after the war, homosexuals were imprisoned were not recognized as being victims of the Nazis. Some men were forced to continue to serve out the term of their imprisonment, even if they had been forced into concentration camps that had been liberated. Paragraph 175 did not get amended until 1969, and before that happened, many gay men were living in fear that they could be arrested or put into prison. It wasn't until more than 40 years after the Nazi persecution on May 8, 1985, that West German President Richard von Weizsäcker acknowledged the damage that the Nazis did to the homosexual population and community. In 1994, paragraph 175 was finally abolished, and by 2002, it is now almost 60 years after these atrocities took place. Germany pardoned those who'd been convicted under that statute. In 1948, a study was published called Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, written by A.C. Kinsey, W.B. Pomeroy, and C.E. Martin. It was the first statistical study of its kind and relied on personal interviews. It became a sensation, although the original intention was meant to be for professional readership. In 1953, Kinsey published its counterpart, Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. Over time, they have been criticized for irregularities in sampling and the nature of interviews being unreliable. In 1952, the first edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders was published, and within the book, homosexuality was classified under sociopathic personality disturbance. The second edition in 1968 still included homosexuality, but it was under the heading of personality disorders. The third edition, published in 1980, called it ego-dystonic homosexuality and recategorized it as a psychosexual disorder. By the fifth edition, published in 2013, homosexuality was completely removed from the DSM. Alan Turing, the pioneer of artificial intelligence and modern cognitive science, as well as one of the creators of the bomb, which was the code-cracking machine designed to break the code used by Nazis to transfer and encrypt information. According to some historians, this helped considerably end the war roughly 2 to 4 years early. Unfortunately, in 1952, when the police were responding to a break-in at his home, they found evidence of Turing leading a homosexual lifestyle, as he had been having a sexual relationship with a man named Arnold Murray, who had known the identity of the burglar. Both of the men were charged with gross indecency, as at the time homosexuality was illegal in the United Kingdom. Turing pleaded guilty and was given the choice to choose to serve jail time or to be chemically castrated. He did not want to lose his job, so he chose the latter. He was forced to take injections of estrogen that would curb his libido and make him impotent. Due to him being arrested and charged with a crime, he lost his security clearances and couldn't do code-breaking work anymore with the government. He was considered a security risk too, and he was being harassed by police. On June 8, 1954, he was found dead of cyanide poisoning by his maid. There was an apple by his side, as it was believed that the cyanide was injected into the apple, but the apple was never tested, and the coroner ruled his death a suicide. In 2021, a BBC article argued that there was never any real evidence that he had committed suicide, and that he may have accidentally inhaled the cyanide during a chemistry experiment. In 2013, Queen Elizabeth II gave Turing a posthumous royal pardon. A couple years after that, the British government announced Turing's Law, which was a posthumous pardon of others who had experienced and suffered the same conviction as Turing. In 2021, he became the face of the 50-pound note that went into circulation on Turing's birthday. In 1953, Dwight Eisenhower passed Executive Order 10450, which allowed for the investigation, interrogation, and removal of gay individuals from the federal government. This was known as the Lavender Scare. Historian David K. Johnson said that there was a fear that gay men and women, quote, posed a threat to national security because they were vulnerable to blackmail and were considered to have weak moral characters, end quote. This was happening simultaneously as Senator Joseph McCarthy's Red Scare campaign that was going on, forcing thousands of alleged subversive communists out of the federal government. Johnson said that without hearing about the Lavender Scare as well as the Red Scare, you are only hearing part of the story. He says, quote, "It's important to remember that the Cold War was perceived as a kind of moral crusade. It's a classic case of scapegoating," end quote. The government employees were subjected to intense scrutiny, questioned without a lawyer present. It was described as an invasive experience, and they were asked questions about their sexual lives. Some employees voluntarily resigned after they had been questioned, and some even committed suicide. Johnson estimates that 5,000 to 10,000 people lost their jobs due to the Lavender Scare. It's hard to know the true number of individuals affected, as any person who was gay would likely not want to work for the federal government. And it wasn't just people in government who were affected, it was also people in the entertainment industry. Josh Howard, director of the 2017 documentary The Lavender Scare, said, quote, "The question of how many people were fired doesn't really even capture the extent to which this affected people's lives," end quote. Frank Kameny, who worked at the Army Map Service, was fired in 1957 due to his sexuality. He fought the decision and sued, declaring it a civil rights issue rather than a national security issue. By 1965, there were gay people picketing outside the White House and helping other gay people who were fired from their jobs with their court cases. In 1975, the Civil Service Commission announced a new rule that gay people could no longer be barred or fired from federal government due to their sexuality. Discrimination still continued in agencies where employees needed security clearance, like the NSA. Jamie Shoemaker, an employee at the NSA, helped Kameny, who came to him for advice when he was afraid that he was going to lose his job. With Kameny's help, Shoemaker became the first gay employee at the NSA to keep his job and his security clearance. However, there was a condition, and he had to tell his family that he was gay. In 1995, President Bill Clinton passed a law that allowed gay individuals to possess security clearances and banned discrimination in granting them. And finally, in 1998, that discrimination was banned in government employment. While the Obama administration had removed the policy that transgender people could serve openly in the military, as well as being given funding for gender reassignment surgery, in 2017, Donald Trump tweeted that transgender people will no longer be allowed to serve in the military, citing, quote, "tremendous medical costs and disruption," end quote. Defense Secretary Jim Mathis refined the statement to say that it was going to limit it to individuals who struggle with body dysmorphia or when the biological sex and identity don't match. He also stated that several hundred transgender people were already openly serving or were willing to serve in their biological sex. This was thankfully repealed in 2021 when Biden signed an executive order that allowed, quote, "qualified Americans to serve their country in uniform," end quote. He said, quote, "It is my conviction as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces that gender identity should not be a bar to military service. Moreover, there is substantial evidence that allowing transgender individuals to serve in the military does not have any meaningful negative impact on the armed forces," end quote. Jennifer L. Levi, the director of Transgender Rights Project at LGBTQ Legal Advocates and Defenders, discussed how the Lavender Scare ran parallel to the transgender military ban. Quote, "The goal in both of these was to demonize a community. It was to send a message that it's not okay to be who you are. And it was effective." Please subscribe to my podcast. And if you are listening on iTunes, please give the podcast 5 stars. It really helps me get out there. I am currently on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and X, so follow me on social media as well. If you are looking for sources for this episode, please check out our show notes. Transcripts and sources will be on my website, notyourhistoryclass.com. Researching, hosting, production, and editing is done by Lauren Powers. Theme song is done by Mike Meyers, and you can find him at the Mike Show 42 on X. If you have any recommendations or suggestions for a future episode, you can direct message me via social media or email me at notyourhistoryclass@gmail.com.